Part II. Combray. Section 17. I remembered the words that M. Vinteuil had used to my parents in apologizing for an obtrusive sheet of music. This photograph was, of course, in common use in their ritual observances, was subjected to daily profanation, for the friend replied, in words that were evidently a liturgical response, "Let him stay there. He can't trouble us any longer. Do you think he'd start whining? Do you think he'd pack you out of the house if he could see you now, with a window open, the ugly old monkey?" To which Mademoiselle Vinteuil replied, "Oh, please!" a gentle reproach which testified to the genuine goodness of her nature, not that it was prompted by any resentment at hearing her father spoken of in this fashion, for that was evidently a feeling which she had trained herself, by a long course of sophistries, to keep in close subjection at such moments, but rather because it was the bridle which, so as to avoid all appearance of egotism, she herself used to curb the gratification which her friend was attempting to procure for her. It may well have been, too, that the smiling moderation with which she faced and answered these blasphemies, that this tender and hypocritical rebuke, appeared to her frank and generous nature as a particularly shameful and seductive form of that criminal attitude towards life which she was endeavoring to adopt. But she could not resist the attraction of being treated with affection by a woman who had just shown herself so implacable towards the defenseless dead. She sprang on to the knees of her friend and held out a chaste brow to be kissed, precisely as a daughter would have done to her mother, feeling with exquisite joy that they would thus between them inflict the last turn of the screw of cruelty, in robbing M. Vinteuil, as though they were actually rifling his tomb of the sacred rights of fatherhood. Her friend took the girl's head in her hands and placed a kiss on her brow, with a docility prompted by the real affection she had for Mademoiselle Vinteuil, as well as by the desire to bring what distraction she could into the dull and melancholy life of an orphan. "Do you know what I should like to do to that old horror?" she said, taking up the photograph. She murmured in Mademoiselle Vinteuil's ear something that I could not distinguish. "Oh, you would never dare!" "Not dare to spit on it? On that?" shouted the friend with deliberate brutality. I heard no more, for Mademoiselle Vinteuil, who now seemed weary, awkward, preoccupied, sincere, and rather sad, came back to the window and drew the shutters close. But I knew now what was the reward that M. Vinteuil, in return for all the suffering that he had endured in his lifetime on account of his daughter, had received from her after his death. And yet I have since reflected that if M. Vinteuil had been able to be present at this scene, he might still, and in spite of everything, have continued to believe in his daughter's soundness of heart, and that he might even in so doing have been not altogether wrong. It was true that in all Mademoiselle Vinteuil's actions the appearance of evil was so strong and so consistent that it would have been hard to find it exhibited in such completeness save in what is nowadays called a sadist. It is behind the footlights of a Paris theatre, and not under the homely lamp of an actual country house, that one expects to see a girl leading her friend on to spit upon the portrait of a father who has lived and died for nothing and no one but herself. And when we find in real life a desire for melodramatic effect, it is generally the sadic instinct that is responsible for it. It is possible that, without being in the least inclined towards sadism, a girl might have shown the same outrageous cruelty as Mademoiselle Vinteuil in desecrating the memory and defying the wishes of her dead father, but she would not have given them deliberate expression in an act so crude in its symbolism, so lacking in subtlety. The criminal element in her behavior would have been less evident to other people, and even to herself, since she would not have admitted to herself that she was doing wrong. But, appearances apart, in Mademoiselle Vinteuil's soul, at least in the earlier stages, the evil element was probably not unmixed. A sadist of her kind is an artist in evil, which a wholly wicked person could not be, for in that case the evil would not have been external, it would have seemed quite natural to her, and would not even have been distinguishable from herself. And as for virtue, respect for the dead, filial obedience, since she would never have practiced the cult of these things, she would take no impious delight in their profanation. Sadists of Mademoiselle Vinteuil's sort are creatures so purely sentimental, so virtuous by nature that even sensual pleasure appears to them as something bad, a privilege reserved for the wicked. And when they allow themselves for a moment to enjoy it, they endeavor to impersonate, to assume all the outward appearance of wicked people for themselves and their partners in guilt, so as to gain the momentary illusion of having escaped beyond the control of their own gentle and scrupulous natures into the inhuman world of pleasure. And I could understand how she must have longed for such an escape when I realized that it was impossible for her to effect it. At the moment when she wished to be thought the very antithesis of her father, what she at once suggested to me were the mannerisms and thought and speech of the poor old music master. Indeed, his photograph was nothing. What she really desecrated, what she corrupted into ministering to her pleasures, but what remained between them and her and prevented her from any direct enjoyment of them, was the likeness between her face and his mother's blue eyes which he had handed down to her, like some trinket to be kept in the family, those little friendly movements and inclinations which set up between the viciousness of Mademoiselle Von Toya and herself a phraseology, a mentality not designed for vice, which made her regard it as not in any way different from the numberless little social duties and courtesies to which she must devote herself every day. It was not evil that gave her the idea of pleasure that seemed to her attractive. It was pleasure, rather, that seemed evil. And as, every time that she indulged in it, pleasure came to her attended by evil thoughts, such as ordinarily had no place in her virtuous mind, she came at length to see in pleasure itself something diabolical, to identify it with evil. Perhaps Mademoiselle Von Toya felt that at heart her friend was not altogether bad, not really sincere when she gave vent to those blasphemous utterances. At any rate, she had the pleasure of receiving those kisses on her brow, those smiles, those glances, all feigned perhaps, but akin, in their base and vicious mode of expression, to those which would have been discernible on the face of a creature formed not out of kindness and long-suffering, but out of self-indulgence and cruelty. She was able to delude herself for a moment into believing that she was indeed amusing herself in the way in which, with so unnatural an accomplice, a girl might amuse herself who really did experience that savage antipathy towards her father's memory. Perhaps she would not have thought of wickedness as a state so rare, so abnormal, so exotic, one which it was so refreshing to visit, had she been able to distinguish in herself, as in all her fellow men and women, that indifference to the sufferings which they cause, which, whatever names else be given it, is the one true, terrible, and lasting form of cruelty. If the Méséglise way was so easy, it was a very different matter when we took the Guermantes way, for that meant a long walk, and we must make sure first of the weather. When we seemed to have entered upon a spell of fine days, when Françoise, in desperation that not a drop was falling upon the poor crops, gazing up at the sky and seeing there only a little white cloud floating here and there upon its calm azure surface, groaned aloud and exclaimed, "You would say they were nothing more nor less than a lot of dogfish swimming about and sticking up their snouts. Ah, they never think of making it rain a little for the poor laborers. And then, when the corn is all ripe, down it will come, rattling all over the place, and think no more of where it is falling than if it was on the sea." When my father's appeals to the gardener had met with the same encouraging answer several times in succession, then some one would say at dinner, "To morrow, if the weather holds, we might go the Guermantes way." And off we would set, immediately after luncheon, through the little garden gate, which dropped us into the Rue de Perchamps, narrow and bent at a sharp angle, dotted with grass plots over which 2 or 3 wasps would spend the day botanizing, a street as quaint as its name, from which its odd characteristics and its personality were, I felt, derived, a street for which one might search in vain through the Combray of to-day, for the public school now rises upon its site. But in my dreams of Combray, like those architects, pupils of Viollet-le-Duc, who, fancying that they can detect beneath a Renaissance rood loft and an 18th century altar traces of a Norman choir, restore the whole church to the state in which it probably was in the 12th century. I leave not a stone of the modern edifice standing. I pierce through it and restore the Rue de Perchamps. And for such reconstruction memory furnishes me with more detailed guidance than is generally at the disposal of restorers. the pictures which it has preserved, perhaps the last surviving in the world today, and soon to follow the rest into oblivion, of what Combray looked like in my childhood's days, pictures which, simply because it was the old Combray that traced their outlines upon my mind before it vanished, are as moving, if I may compare a humble landscape with those glorious works, reproductions of which my grandfather was so fond of bestowing on me, as those old engravings of the Sinacolo, or that painting by Gentile Bellini in which one sees, in a state in which they no longer exist, the masterpiece of Leonardo and the portico of St. Mark's. We would pass in the Rue de l'Oiseau before the old hostelry of the Oiseau Fléché, into whose great courtyard once upon a time would rumble the coaches of the Duchesses de Montpensier, d'Erguemont, and de Montmorency, when they had come down to Combray for some litigation with their farmers, or to receive homage from them. We would come at length to the Mall, among whose tree tops I could distinguish the steeple of Saint Hilaire. And I should have liked to be able to sit down and spend the whole day there, reading and listening to the bells, for it was so charming there and so quiet that when an hour struck you would have said not that it broke in upon the calm of the day, but that it relieved the day of its superfluity, and that the steeple, with the indolent, painstaking exactitude of a person who has nothing else to do, had simply, in order to squeeze out and let fall the few golden drops which had slowly and naturally accumulated in the hot sunlight, pressed at a given moment the distended surface of the silence. The great charm of the Guermantes way was that we had beside us, almost all the time, the course of the Vivonne. We crossed it first, 10 minutes after leaving the house, by a footbridge called the Pont Vieux. And every year, when we arrived at Combray on Easter morning after the sermon, if the weather was fine, I would run there to see, amid all the disorder that prevails on the morning of a great festival, the gorgeous preparations for which make the everyday household utensils that they have not contrived to banish seem more sordid than ever. The river flowing past, sky blue already between banks still black and bare, its only companions a clump of daffodils, come out before their time, a few primroses, the first in flower, while here and there burned the blue flame of a violet, its stem bent beneath the weight of the drop of perfume stored in its tiny horn. The Pont Vieux led to a tow path, which, at this point, would be overhung in summer by the bluish foliage of a hazel, under which a fisherman in a straw hat seemed to have taken root. At Combray, where I knew every one and could always detect the blacksmith or grocer's boy through his disguise of a beadle's uniform or chorister's surplice, this fisherman was the only person whom I was never able to identify. He must have known my family, for he used to raise his hat when we passed, and then I would always be just on the point of asking his name when some one would make a sign to me to be quiet, or I would frighten the fish. We would follow the tow path, which ran along the top of a steep bank several feet above the stream. The ground on the other side was lower, and stretched in a series of broad meadows as far as the village and even to the distant railway station. Over these were strewn the remains, half buried in the long grass, of the castle of the old Counts of Combray, who, during the Middle Ages, had had on this side the course of the Vivonne as a barrier and defense against attack from the lords of Guermantes and abbots of Martinville. Nothing was left now but a few stumps of towers, hummocks upon the broad surface of the fields, hardly visible, broken battlements over which, in their day, the bowmen had hurled down stones, the watchmen had gazed out over Novepont, Clairefontaine, Martinville-le-Sec, Bellu, Luxempt, fiefs, all of them of Guermantes, a ring in which Combray was locked, but fallen among the grass now, levelled with the ground, climbed and commanded by boys from the Christian Brothers School, who came there in their playtime or with lesson books to be conned, emblems of a past that had sunk down and well nigh vanished under the earth, that lay by the water's edge now like an idler taking the air, yet giving me strong food for thought, making the name of Combray connote to me not the little town of to-day only, but an historic city vastly different, seizing and holding my imagination by the remote, incomprehensible features which it half concealed beneath the spangled veil of buttercups. For the buttercups grew past numbering on this spot which they had chosen for their games among the grass, standing singly, in couples, in whole companies, yellow as a yolk of eggs and glowing with an added lustre, I felt, because, being powerless to consummate with my palate the pleasure which the sight of them never failed to give me, I would let it accumulate as my eyes ranged over their gilded expanse, until it had acquired the strength to create in my mind a fresh example of absolute, unproductive beauty. And so it had been from my earliest childhood, when from the tow-path I had stretched out my arms towards them, before even I could pronounce their charming name, a name fit for the prince in some French fairy tale, colonist perhaps in some far distant century from Asia, but naturalized now forever in the village, well satisfied with their modest horizon, rejoicing in the sunshine and the water's edge, faithful to their little glimpse of the railway station, yet keeping none the less, as do some of our old paintings in their plebeian simplicity, a poetic scintillation from the golden East. I would amuse myself by watching the glass jars which the boys used to lower into the vivant to catch minnows, and which, filled by the current of the stream, in which they themselves also were enclosed, at once containers whose transparent sides were like solidified water, and contents plunged into a still larger container of liquid, flowing crystal, suggested an image of coolness more delicious and more provoking than the same water in the same jars would have done standing upon a table laid for dinner, by showing it as perpetually in flight between the impalpable water, in which my hands could not arrest it, and the insoluble glass, in which my palate could not enjoy it. I decided that I would come there again with a line and catch fish. I begged for and obtained a morsel of bread from our luncheon basket, and threw into the vivant pellets which had the power, it seemed, to bring about a chemical precipitation, for the water at once grew solid round about them in oval clusters of emaciated tadpoles, which until then it had no doubt been holding in solution, invisible, but ready and alert to enter the stage of crystallization. End of Part II, Section 17.